And we are live. And I want to say sorry for the delay. It's my fault. I didn't know that Spain had daylight savings. I thought it was an American invention, but no. So here we are. New episode of Whisky en tu casa. Un nuevo episodio de Whisky en tu casa. Y perdón por el retraso, pero hay un cambio de horario en España del cual yo no sabía. So today we have Gemma Paterson, the Global Ambassador for the Balvenie, la Embajadora Global de Balvenie, and it's a pleasure to have you. We also have Verónica Tomaghelli. We call her Lady Malt. And ella se trabaja con los contenidos en whisky en Buenos Aires. Andrés Sánchez de Whisky Malt Colombia. And the one and only Manu Iturregi, Café Residence en Bilbao.
Hola.
You know, Gemma, I interviewed you a year ago. The world is different now. But I bet there's one thing that has not changed, and that Balvenie takes its time to make whiskey. And am I right, or the pandemic has forced you to either release new products online or host virtual events? And in Spanish, I'm going to say that hace un año le entrevisté a Gemma para el website Catador Itinerante. Y el mundo ha cambiado en este año. Y la pregunta es si Balvenie sigue teniendo esa paciencia al hacer los productos o si cambió un poco debido al mundo online. Gemma?
Yeah, Pablo, so you're right. In a year, not really a lot changes at Balvenie, but the sad thing is the distillery is a lot quieter. So everyone at home can be rest assured we're still making whiskey. The pandemic has not affected our production at all. So here's a little cheers and toast to all of our craftsmen at Balvenie who have been day in, day out, still making whiskey. Nothing has changed for them and for their schedule. However, we haven't had any visitors to Balvenie, which has been a sad thing. So round the grounds, normally we would have tours all year round at the distillery and we'd host thousands of visitors. Normally we have around 3,000-4,000 visitors from across the world to the distillery. We have those kind of 2 tours a day with 8 people in the morning and in the afternoon, and sometimes bartenders, bar owners, other whiskey enthusiasts, people from around the world come into the distillery that we host. So that's been hard to miss out on that and not have our visitors to Balvenie.
Gemma nos está contando que por suerte las cosas no cambiaron en Balvenie en cuanto a la producción de whisky. Siguen haciendo el mismo estilo de whisky con la misma paciencia y dedicación, pero extrañan los tours porque está cerrada la destilería al público. Generalmente reciben gente de bares y otras partes de la ciudad, y de hecho Balvenie tiene un tour muy especial que es una pena que no lo están haciendo. Do you have is there any date on site about reopening for tour or not for now?
At the moment, not for now. We did have, we planned to reopen in September and then that got pushed back to October. And now in Scotland, we're in a situation where we're kind of in various tiers of lockdown across the country. So Speyside, we're tier 1, we're on the lowest level, but down in the Central Belt, Edinburgh, Glasgow, they're up on tier 3. So everyone's kind of in a different bit of a situation across the country. So we've made the decision, and things have gotten very quiet in Scotland again. So now we got quite busy after lockdown lifted, end of summer, beginning of autumn. There was lots of camper vans around, a lot of people traveling and visiting. So the tourism was kind of boosted a bit. But now things have gotten really quiet. So there's no plans to open Balvenie for visitors this year. But we have big plans to start to bring people virtually to the distillery. Ooh. Which I can talk a little bit more about. I've already started that.
Por ahora no hay planes de reabrir la destilería, y una de las cosas que nos decía Gemma es que estuvieron a punto de reabrir, pensaron que tal vez septiembre era un buen momento, después no. Por un momento subió el turismo en Escocia, pero ahora está bastante más tranquilo de nuevo. Muchos países están viviendo la segunda ola de la pandemia, una nueva ola. Así que Lo que sí cuenta Gemma es que tienen planes para hacer tal vez un tour virtual. And Gemma, when we talked last year, I was launching a year ago the Women in Whisky section. And I think since then, I've been hearing more and more about new women, even taking over a lot of master distillers' roles. The last one I heard was Glen Roth's Laura Rampling. And is that becoming a norm?
Laura used to work with us, actually.
Oh.
Laura was in the role that Kelsey McKechnie is in today. Laura worked in that role prior to Kelsey.
Oh, wow. So she was getting ready to take over David?
Laura worked kind of alongside David and Brian very closely in supporting them within the Whisky Stocks team.
So, le preguntaba a Gemma que hace un año cuando la entrevisté empecé la sección Whisky, Mujeres del Whisky en el website de Catadora Itinerante y en el último año he escuchado más y más de mujeres teniendo el rol de Master Distiller, como por ejemplo Lila Serenelli in Alasana is one of them in Argentina. She has been there for a while. Pero the last one was that I heard was Laura Rampling in Glen Roth. Gemma nos está... La última Laura Rampling de Glen Roth, Gemma nos dice que antes ella trabajaba en the Balvenie. So do you think it's becoming a norm that more and more distilleries want women in those roles of those type of, sensitive roles of using your senses, aromas, understanding how the whiskey is made?
I think probably what it comes down to is seeing more women in those roles, whereas traditionally it was quite a male-dominated space. The more women you have, like having Kelsey McKechnie as our apprentice malt master, and she publicly is out there chatting about Balvenie and her job, and then obviously women who've been involved in whiskey for a long time, like of Rachel Barry, that you have, and also obviously Stephanie as well, who's working with Dewars. So there's been quite a few women working in these roles within the industry, but I think the more the more PR and the more they're out there talking about their job and what they do, it inspires more women to then go and apply for these roles as well.
Gemma nos dice que ha sido muy inspirador ver cómo nuevas mujeres toman este rol, un rol que siempre fue dominado por hombres, y es inspirador que haya nuevas mujeres que están siendo nombradas y eso hace que más mujeres se lancen. Vero, is there anything you want to add? Are you studying for Master Distiller?
No.
¿Algo que quieres decir sobre el rol de la mujer en whisky en los últimos años?
Yo considero que es muy importante porque obviamente, como decía Gemma, es un lugar de hombres siempre, sobre todo acá en Sudamérica, fue un lugar que ocuparon los hombres. Y de un tiempo a esta parte, yo hace 20 años que trabajo en pos de la industria del whisky y siempre traté de capacitarme y veo que a medida que va pasando el tiempo hay más mujeres mucho más como seguras de sí mismas de pararse enfrente de una audiencia masculina y hablar de este destilado, ¿no? Que es tan genuino. Y sobre todo lo que más me llama la atención, como vos recién nombrabas a Lila, es una alegría para mí primero por saber cómo es ella, básicamente como persona, que haya una mujer que se dedique a esto enteramente los 365 días del año y que pueda producir whisky y que esa sensibilidad de la que vos estabas hablando recién se vea transmitida en cada uno de los destilados que ellos producen, ¿no es cierto? Entonces me parece que está buenísimo y ya no, me parece que no es una condición ser hombre para trabajar en la industria del whisky, que eso a mí me llena de orgullo y de emoción porque imagínate que si no, no podría estar sentada compartiendo con ustedes.
Vero is saying that she has been in the whiskey industry for 20 years and, especially in Latin America, there was a lot of whiskeys for men. And she feels very, very proud now the fact that somebody like Lila Serenelli in the Argentine single malt La Sana is a master distiller. And more women, like you mentioned, are now feeling comfortable talking to them sometimes to a male audience mostly. And this is a very, very good step.
Yeah, it's women like Vero who set the path for that, really, for us all. I've only worked on whiskey for 7 years now. I'm a whiskey baby, really, in comparison to a lot of my colleagues and people like Vero. So
Pero dice que vos sos una de las que lograron que el camino se allane, porque ella Gemma está hace 7 años en whisky, vos hace 20.
Sí, empecé acá en Argentina. Creo que soy la primera mujer en hablar de whisky y en desarrollar, bueno, un curso específicamente de whisky, porque había sommelier de vino y de un montón de otras bebidas y de whisky no había, entonces dije, ¿por qué no? ¿Por qué no hacer un whisky por ahí exclusivamente? Y bueno, y así es como nació toda esta idea de compartir el conocimiento.
Pero a lot of people were talking about wine in Argentina, and nobody was talking about whiskey like 20 years ago. So she said, why not? And Vero, you were like 10 years old?
I was 20.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to open to the rest of the panel. And we tend to associate Balvenie with a delicate, sweet Speyside profile, but Manu, I think, for example, is drinking or about to drink a peat week. Can we talk about peat? Can we talk about peat in Balvenie? And Manu, feel free to jump with questions. Pregunto que a Balvenie se lo asocia con algo delicado y dulce típico de Speyside en Escocia, pero Manu se está por tomar un Balvenie que está ahumado con turba. So let's talk about that, Gemma, and then Manu, what do you think?
So we've had a peated expression now with Balvenie for a couple of years, going back, I think, when was it, 2016 we first launched Peat Week, but 2002 is when we kind of started this legacy of peating Balvenie and having a peated batch of malt that we ran through the distillery. So 2002, our distillery manager at the time was a man called Ian Miller, who is also infamous for traveling the world as Glenfiddich ambassador for many years. But prior to this, actually, Ian worked as our distillery manager across Glenfiddich and Balvenie. And then Ian also, before he joined us at William Grant & Sons, he worked as distillery manager at Mortlach Distillery. He worked at a few other distilleries within the industry. So he had a wealth of distilling knowledge by the time he came to us. He'd never worked at a distillery that had its own floor maltings, and Balvenie was the first time really that he could start to experiment and play with malt. And Ian embarked on a number of trials to experiment with the spirit at the point of distillation. So we have a couple of our whiskies that we've launched as part of the Balvenie Stories series that celebrate Ian and some of the experiments that he conducted. So one of them being our Week of Peat, or Peat Week. I have the tube here. So we worked with an artist called Andy Lovell, who is a screen printer, and he bespoke designed each of these tubes. So this is the pagoda at Balvenie, our maltman collecting the peat here, but this is the Week of Peat, and it celebrates the story of Ian introducing peat trials. So Ian actually went to, if you want me to stop to translate them.
Please. So, en los comienzos del 2000 trabajaron mucho con... can you remind me the last name? Ian...
Miller.
Ian Miller. So Ian Miller trabajó también en destilerías como Mortlach, trabajó también para Glenfiddich, que Glenfiddich es parte del mismo grupo de Balvenie, y empezó a experimentar con estos whiskies. Por eso la botella, las Balvenie Stories son un poco también en homenaje a Ian. Y en la primera vez que Ian trabajó en una destilería que tiene lo que se le dice el floor malting, que en donde se hace el malteado de la cebada en el piso de la destilería. So how does the peat come into play?
So Ian actually went on a trip to Islay, and he went to go and look at Lefroy, Bowmore, and get some inspiration and really delve into how they were peating their malt at these distilleries. He then came back to Balvenie, and our floor maltings is a building that was built in 1929, hadn't we hadn't had any kind of significant updates to the way that we were malting our barley at this point. But Ian installed in the kiln where, so kind of after the malting process, after germination has happened on the floor, and the barley goes to dry before sending on to mill and mash, etc., through the distillery, Ian, he installed a large black peat burner on the side of the kiln. So we have a large fire. If you're in the floor maltings at Balvenie, underneath the pagoda, you'll see a large furnace, which is always burning. So right now there is a fire burning at Balvenie. It's burning 24 hours a day, all year. The only time there is not a fire burning at Balvenie is when we have our annual shutdown and maintenance period. But
can you stop for a second?
Yep.
Ian, después de estudiar los floor malting y cómo ellos en Balvenie se manejaba el tema de secar y preparar la cebada, decidió instalar, el primero fue a Islay, donde están los whisky más ahumados, y se conectó con gente de, por ejemplo, Bowmore y Lafroig, y decidió instalar una especie de caldera u horno para quemar turba, y hay un fuego 24 horas prácticamente en Balvenie, salvo cuando hace mantenimiento una vez al año. Continue, please.
So, Ian...
Una pregunta de Andrés.
Gemma, nice to meet you. I speak Spanish para la gente que nos ve o nos escucha en Colombia.
Seguro.
Gemma, ya que has tenido el honor de poder compartir con David Stewart, y pues sabiendo que él trabaja desde 1962 en la compañía, y tiempo después pues, fue nombrado como Malt Master para The Balvenie, y pues ya con toda su experticia, ¿en qué se basa o cuáles fueron las ideas o cuál es su inspiración para comenzar a crear estos tan raros, tan complejos, tan bien mezclados, ¿no? Y después ensamblarlos en estas barricas tan especiales y llegar a estos matrimonios de maduraciones?
So I'm going to pause Andrés for a second. He's talking about the David Stewart and all these years of experience, and how does a whiskey that is more complex and in Balvenie, what's his inspiration, no? But I wanted to talk about David Stewart later. So see,
I promise, Andres, we could talk about David Stewart for a long time. As you know, he's been in the industry for many years, and just in September he celebrated his 58th anniversary.
58 años ya tiene David Stewart en la compañía. Y antes que nos movamos a David Stewart, quería terminar con la historia de cómo usa Balvenie el pit, la turba. Y Andrés, después volvemos a tu pregunta. Yes, Gemma, so the furnace is burning. You're using...
Always at Balvenie.
Okay.
And going back to kind of what Ian did was he installed a second peat burner. So if anyone who is watching has been to visit Balvenie, you'll have the main furnace that's filled with coal, and then the second one will be filled with the peat. It's like a black burner on the side, and that was to allow Ian to start the peat trials, and it was to allow us to have a lot of control over the peating levels, exactly how much how much ppm we wanted to drive into the malt. So we had a couple of years of trials and experimentation, and then in 2002 we had our very first full production of a peated malt through the distillery. So Ian cleared a week's schedule. We had 1 week of the year where we produced a peated batch of malt. The malt was peated to 28 ppm, and that was processed through the distillery. What you have in your glass right now, Manu, the week of peat, it is around 5 ppm in the glass. So over time, the combination of maturation and post-distillation, the peat really softens with Balvenie. So it's still, quite honeyed, malty, malt notes in the flavor profile, still a sweetness, but just a delicate wisp of peat.
So una semana al año, y por eso le dicen Pit Week, la semana de la turba, se dedican a hacer este whisky ahumado, pero que es un ahumado muy suave y que incluso queda más suave cuando llega a la botella. Manu, you want to add something about this?
Sí, bueno, lo primero que quería comentar o aclarar, que no sé si ha quedado muy claro cuando ha explicado Gemma, es que yo he tenido la suerte de visitar Balvenie 2 veces, 2015 y 2017 o 18. Lo que construyeron es una chimenea al lado. Entonces, tienen una alimentada por carbón y una chimenea donde solo queman turba y tiene, digamos, como una trampilla que pueden abrir o cerrar para pasar ese humo de la turba al humo del carbón y entonces controlan perfectamente el proceso de turbado de la malta, ¿no?
Uh-huh.
Y que ellos siempre, incluso en el Balvenie normal, utilizan un poquito, si no me equivoco. Y yo creo que esto, mi pregunta va, si también puede ser no solo una experimentación mirando al futuro, sino volviendo al pasado, porque si nos fijamos hace 100 años, los whiskies de Speyside también eran conocidos porque tenían ese punto de turba, porque era más barata que comprar de carbón, pero es una turba muy diferente, más floral, más elegante, por así decirlo, menos ruda, que podría ser la de Ayla, ¿no? Son dos estilos totalmente diferentes. Bueno, por cierto, de momento estoy bebiendo Caribbean Cask, el Pitted Week irá después. I have both. It started with Caribbean Cask and then Pit Week.
So Manu is saying that he wanted to just clarify something that I didn't say. That was really cool about the two type of furnaces and the coal and the peat. And he went in 2015 and in 2017 or 18 to Balvenie, and he saw those two working. And it's a very good way to know how to handle both. And one thing that he's asking is it true that even the regular core range uses at least a tiny bit of peat? And also, he said that is more than an experimentation, if this is something like going back to the past in terms of how the space I was many years ago, like 100 years ago, that we're using peat.
Yeah, Manu is absolutely correct. Once upon a time in Scotland, peat is just a readily available fuel source here. So distilleries used peat because it was right on our doorstep. And in fact, that's what you would have used as your fuel at home. So I grew up on the Isle of Lewis and the Hebrides and the West Coast, where people still go out and cut peats. It's very traditional. In the house I grew up in as a teenager, to heat the house, you had to, and to have hot water, we had a big aga that we fueled with peat to kind of give us heat and hot water. And it was, it's still a very traditional way of life on the island. And when I started working at the distillery and at Balvenie, as soon as I got that aroma of peat coming from the pagoda, it took me back, and it made me remind me of my years as a teenager walking around in the streets in the evening, because we lived in a small village, and the kids would all just meet up, and then we just wander the streets at night, basically, with our bikes and whatever, and that smell of peat it takes me right back to those moments in my childhood.
Gemma nos está contando que cuando ella era adolescente y niña también, se acuerda que en la villa donde ella creció, en Escocia, era muy común usar turba para calentar los hogares. Y de hecho, cuando ella empezó a trabajar en Balvenie y sintió ese humo, automáticamente se conectó con su juventud cuando iba por la calle andando en bicicleta con sus amigos, y era lo que se acostumbraba a oler en las casas.
And then to answer Manu's other point, there is always a little bit of peat within the home malted Balvenie. So we don't malt 100% of the malt that goes to make Balvenie. It would be impossible. Every year we produce around 6.8 million litres of spirit. The distillery would run through around 50 tons of malt every day. That would be impossible for us to malt ourselves at Balvenie. We just wouldn't have enough Balvenie to go around if we tried to do that. So we malt around 10%. So the home malted Balvenie, a small batch of it goes into every single mash, and that is peated to around 3 ppm before it goes into the mash. So there is always a tiny amount of Balvenie of peat for every single batch of home malt that we use.
So, voy a ver si entendí bien. Balvenie no tiene capacidad, produce mucho whisky y no tiene capacidad para traer toda la cebada malteada, para hacer toda la cebada malteada en el piso de Balvenie. Entonces hacen más o menos el 10%. El resto lo traen. Y en ese 10% sí utilizan turba a un número muy, muy, muy pequeño de ahumado, que es 3 partes por millón de fenoles. Y es verdad que trae algo, pero es tan poquito el ahumado que generalmente no se percibe.
Claro, normalmente cuando gastas tan bajito, o sea, cuando usas tan poco ahumado, en realidad lo que te sube es como las notas tostadas del New Make Spirit o la sensación de horneado, de leña, pero no llega a percibirse la turba. Y si estamos acostumbrados además a turbas yodadas o más potentes como la de las islas, este tipo de turba de Speyside que cada vez más destilerías están utilizando un poquito, pues es mucho más soft, por así decirlo, ¿no? O sea, son aromas ahumados mucho más parecidos a maderas aromáticas o algo así, ¿no? No hay tanta potencia terrosa como podríamos tener.
Claro, Manu is clarifying that it's not the same type of peat that we are used to from Islay, and it's a little more like woody, not so powerful. So
it's more like that kind of campfire aroma, rather than you don't have any of those kind of medicinal phenols that come through. It's lighter, it's more floral, grassy, campfire.
Menos medicinal y más floral, más de fogata.
And the peat comes from New Pits Ligo, which is just an hour's drive from the distillery, so up towards Fraserburgh.
It's close by.
The vegetation is so different. On Islay, there's no trees, and on these islands, you're close coastal, a small island. There's always influence from the sea. Lots of heather and rootlets that are within that. So whereas in Speyside, there's been a lot more trees, woodland that over the years you'll have within that heather. So the structure of the heather is different. It's not as hard and compact as the heather in Islay either.
La estructura de la turba en Speyside, en Escocia, es muy diferente a la de Islay, de donde salen muchos ahumados que son un poco más medicinales, donde no hay árboles, donde está toda esta influencia del mar y de la costa. Sin embargo, en Speyside, donde crece esta turba, hay mucha más vegetación, árboles, es diferente, otorga un diferente sabor. Andrés, we're gonna go now back to vamos a volver a hablar de la pregunta que hiciste de David y la influencia de David en estos whiskies. Gemma, we talked in the past about how important is the people for Balvenie, and we are talking about a distillery that has Dennis McBain working in stills since 1958, David Stewart 58 years in the industry, Brian Webster is still the mashman. 50 years in Balvenie. Robbie still there?
Robbie has a great story, which I could, if it's appropriate, I could share with you Robbie's story just now.
Básicamente decía que Balvenie tiene sus principales, las personas que se dedican a las diferentes partes de la destilería, como el que se encarga de la malta, del mash, el que se encarga de los alambiques, even Ian, the head coper.
He celebrated 50 years last April.
So, estos son 5 hombres que todos tienen más de 50 años en la destilería, salvo Robbie, que creo que estuvo 40 y pico. Entonces, nos va a contar una historia. Yes, go ahead, Gemma, sorry.
So, Robbie Gormley, he was our head maltman at Balvenie. He's now officially retired. But Robbie joined us 47 years ago. He started working in the warehouse, then moved over to work in the floor maltings. And Robbie, when you go around the distillery and you see some of the other process team, so for example, if you go up to Glenfiddich, one of the stillmen is a man called George Garrick. His nickname is Humpy, and Robbie trained him And so that's quite common across, there's many of the team who Robbie trained, because whenever someone new started at the distilleries, it made sense that they learned to malt first. So they would go to the maltings, they would start with Robbie. So Robbie kind of made or it was make or break with Robbie. If you didn't pass the induction with Robbie, then you weren't going to go to the next stage. So Robbie was a great mentor. He trained many different people across the distilleries. And Robbie worked on many of the experiments as well that we're talking about, Ian. So Robbie was influential within the initial peat trials. He was the one who was there conducting them. Another Balvenie that we just launched is the 19-year-old Edge of Burnhead wood, and we used heather in the kiln to dry that barley. Again, that was Robbie who did that. So he has a lot of great stories of the things that he's done over the years.
So, básicamente nos está contando Gemma que la historia de Robbie es que ahora se acaba de retirar, pero hace 40 y pico de años que está en la destilería y lo usaban como una especie de filtro, donde era lo primero que se aprendía, más que filtro, un mentor está usando Gemma, que es más apropiado. Entonces él fue el mentor de mucha gente en la destilería, incluso gente en Glenfiddich y en otros lugares. Y siempre el primer paso era ir a Robbie a que te entrene, y si no pasabas, pero entonces no te iba a ir bien en la destilería. Y Robbie también fue parte de muchos experimentos. Andrés, respondiendo un poco a tu pregunta de dónde viene la inspiración, no es solo inspiration, is not only David Stewart, all these different pieces, all these people working for so long have been part of these experiments. Gemma, ¿quieres decir algo sobre lo que es el trabajo de David Stewart and what's the importance of somebody like David? What is going to be the next generation once Kelsey jump in? And then I'd like to go to Vero for a question.
I think it's special in that these techniques have been passed on hand to hand from one generation to the next. So, David had a mentor before him, Hamish Robertson. Robbie had a mentor before him that worked in the floor maltings. Ian MacDonald in the cooperage had a mentor before him that he learned his techniques from. And that sort of mentor position is really important at Balvenie, and we don't talk so much about the next generation, but they're there. We talk a lot about Kelsey because she works so closely with David on a daily basis, but there's apprentices across the entire distillery. And in fact, Dennis McBain, we talk about him being such a legend. He joined us in 1958 and has been coppersmith for a long time and has so many great stories to tell and to share. But Dennis's apprentice is George Singer, but George has been in the role for 17 years. Dennis hired George 17 years ago. So he's already, full-time doing the job. Dennis now just works as kind of more of an ambassadorial role, really. He's not doing heavy coppersmithing every day now, but Dennis will come and host visitors at the distillery, and he's stepped down from that. So the next generation is there, and they've been learning and studying as well and ready to take over.
How many years Kelsey has been working with David? 2-3 years?
Since Kelsey joined the company in 2014, and she's worked across all of our distilleries, basically. She spent time over in Ireland working in Tullamore. She spent time working in Girvan in the grain operations. She spent time working with Leslie Gracie on Hendrick's Gin. She's been up in Dufton, worked across Glenfiddich and Balvenie. And she's been working closely with David for since 2018. So, 2 years.
Gemma nos estaba contando que este tipo de mentoreo que usan en Balvenie funciona hace muchos años, incluso antes de que todos estos hombres que han estado 40, 50 años en la destilería trabajen. Ellos tuvieron sus propios mentores y que constantemente les traen aprendices a estos expertos que son los que manejan estos roles para que sigan las nuevas generaciones. Nos cuenta, por ejemplo, de Dennis McBain, que es una leyenda ya, que está desde 1958. Su aprendiz ya tiene 17 años en la compañía, o sea, ya es prácticamente el que hace todo el trabajo, y Dennis funciona a un nivel más alto promocionando la compañía. Y está Kelsey, que todos los ojos están puestos en Kelsey porque ella va a tomar el rol de Malt Master de David Stewart. se unió a la compañía en el 2014, trabajó en varias destilerías del grupo, incluyendo Tullamore en Irlanda, Girvan, que es de whisky de grano, y ahora hace un par de años que está de la mano de David Stewart. Vero, ¿tenés alguna pregunta?
Sí,
Seguro que sí.
escuchando con atención esta cuestión de que Balvenie es como un núcleo que va trabajando de generación en generación con personas, no tanto con máquinas como en muchas destilerías que tal vez hoy pertenecen a grupos multinacionales y es todo como más automático. ¿Qué visión tiene la destilería de cara al futuro en esta cuestión de empezar a trabajar con maquinaria y no tanto, digamos, con los sentidos de las personas? ¿Tienen idea de hacer eso o ellos prefieren trabajar de manera tradicional porque es una de las pocas destilerías que siguen trabajando de una manera tan tradicional con esta cuestión de elegir, por ejemplo, el tipo de cebada que se va a utilizar, con hacer todas estas pruebas, más que nada trabajando con los sentidos y no tanto basado, digamos, en términos de laboratorio, ¿no?
So Vero is asking, talking about future and the use of technology in the distillery. You are so driven through all these experts, and the question is in the future if you plan to continue working in traditional way, or how are you going to incorporate all this technology at these chances of using more computers?
It's a really good point, Vero. I think we kind of have that up the road at Glenfiddich. So the great thing about, and the reason for kind of having two distilleries is, Glenfiddich is definitely super high tech, and especially we've just built a new still house up there, a third still house, and operation. We've got 2 new mash tuns up there now, so there's 4 mash tuns at Glenfiddich, and the operation is definitely very tech driven. Whereas down at Balvenie, we have that luxury of being a little bit more traditional and kind of old school in how things are. Don't get me wrong, there's computers. So the mashman, the stillman, they certainly have computer programs that they use to deal with everything. So it's kind of semi-automated, the distillery now, with the main production. So when it comes to the milling, mashing, fermentation, distillation, that's all sort of semi-automated. The things that are really done by hand would be obviously the farm, the maltings, the coopering, which is always obviously when it comes to any distillery, those kind of refurbishing the barrels is very much a hands-on task.
La destilería funciona de una manera, digamos, semiautomática. Usan computadoras y todos saben cómo manejar los programas y el software para que la destilería tenga precisión, pero hay trabajos que se siguen haciendo manuales, como por ejemplo el tratado y la refabricación constante de las barricas, y el tema del malteado de piso, etc. I would like to go to talk about what we're drinking, and Gemma is going to be the first, then we can go to Vero, Manu, and Andrés.
So I just poured myself a little dram of the Double Wood 12, which is our flagship. So it felt right to kind of pour a wee dram of this.
And so the first one where you fell in love with whiskey.
That's right. Yeah.
Gemma está tomando lo que le dice el flagship, que es el whisky principal de la gama, es el Balvenie 12 años, que está añejado en 2 maderas. Y de hecho, en una historia, Gemma contó que fue que probó por primera vez su primer whisky fue el Balvenie 12, y a partir de ahí se enamoró del whisky. Vero, what are you drinking? ¿Qué estás tomando?
Tengo acá Balvenie 12, un Double Good, like yours, Gemma, pero no sé, tengo las 2 botellas cerradas, el Caribbean Cask y el Golden Cask. Me gustaría que me den su opinión, así compartimos notas de cata si quieren.
¿De cuál?
Ustedes me dicen, Manu me parece que iba con un Caribbean
14,
Cask, así.
sí. Abril 16.
Bueno, abrimos el 16 entonces.
Vero will open the 16-year-old, and she wants to know your opinion too.
Yeah, Vero has 2 very interesting bottles there with the golden cask and the 16 triple cask. The golden cask is really part of the journey that Balvenie has been through when it comes to rum cask finishing. So the golden cask, actually, we've experimented with a few different types and profiles of rum over the years, until in 2010 we released the Balvenie Caribbean cask, which is a blend of Caribbean rums. So basically, we have a bespoke blend of Caribbean rum that's delivered to the distillery that we then mature on site to season rum casks. We'll then send on and transfer our 14-year-old ex-bourbon barrel matured Balvenie into the rum cask for 6 months. So technically, we have a rum bodega in the Highlands of Scotland at the Balvenie distillery specifically for the Caribbean cask.
Did you ever taste or sold that rum?
Yeah, I have a bottle of it here at home.
That's only for employees?
Well, we've never sold it.
You never released
of any rum more.
So, Gemma está contando que el 14 años Caribbean Cask, ellos maduraron el ron en Escocia para después usar las barricas vacías en el whisky. Y ella dice que tiene una botella ahí del ron, pero nunca Balvenie lo vendió.
Yeah, the golden cask that Vero has was specifically Jamaican rum. It was a Jamaican rum barrel, not a blend that came to the distillery, but a Jamaican rum barrel that was finished in.
Which is Jamaican rum?
Was exclusive the golden cask was exclusive for travel retail.
Mm-hmm. And it's usually funkier the Jamaican rum. I can't imagine like how it feels with the whiskey. And Manu.
I started with the 14 Caribbean cask, which is now in the core range of Balvenie in the Spanish market. And now I just serve a dram of this Pidwick. I think the Pidwick is a release that varies, is different every year, or it's not the same. No, I seem that from the one you showed before, I tasted both, and there are small differences. No.
So we had a whiskey, Manu, from 2016, 2017. We had the Peat Week, which was a vintage. So we had the 2002 and then a 2003. In 2018, last year, 2019, we removed the vintage. It's essentially the same profile, but just without the vintage on the bottle anymore, which is the Week of Peat. That's what you have there. But the profile, so it is around 5 ppm in the glass, and it's 100% American oak that's been used for that Week of Peat as well.
But are you going to use batch numbers in the future?
No, not anymore on the Week of Peat.
Okay. So,
the bottle before is for collectors, no? I have one, I think.
Yeah, we've slightly changed it, and that really was, when we created the stories range with Balvenie, the story of the Week of Peat was such a great story that it made sense to bring it into as part of the stories range.
And then Manu decía que tiene una botella donde tenía el año, y ahora Balvenie no lo hace más. A partir de ahora, los próximos Week of Peat van a ser similares cada año y no por vintage, no por año. Con lo cual Manu dice, la botella que tengo en casa es para coleccionistas. Andrés, ¿qué estás tomando? No sé si está un poquito...
No, perdón, he's frozen, yeah.
Andrés estuvo tomando antes de que
empiece. You don't want to prod him and make sure he's okay.
Antes de que empecemos el programa, Andrés se estaba preparando y ya tenía algo en el vaso. Y ahora el vaso puede ser que esté vacío, pero se nos congeló Andrés, ya volverá pronto. Yo estoy tomando un 21 años the last drops that I have from a sample that is a Balvenie 21 Portwood. Es 21 años en ex barricas de Oporto. And Gemma, you want to say something about the 21?
Yeah, I'd love to. I wish that's what I had in my glass right now. The 21 Portwood, it's matured for 21 years in ex-American bourbon barrels and then finished in vintage tawny port pipes. They've been used to mature ports in Portugal for tawny ports for 40 odd years by the time they're then sent up to us at the distillery. At that stage,
40?
Yeah, so they've matured many ports. So, you know, they've worked through, there's been a lot of different ports matured in those pipes over the years. They've worked through a whole cycle of various tawny ports before we get our hands on them. By the time they arrive at Balvenie, I mean, the pipes just look beautiful. They're aged, the hoops are rusted, the staves are aged. The wood, there's not really a lot of flavor left within the wood, but what we're looking for is that port that's within the oak to leach out into Balvenie. So for this one, the 21 Portwood, the flavors are really influenced by the ports that have been maturing in those port pipes. So we finished for only 4 months in port.
4 months.
Yeah.
And the rest you say is ex-bourbon?
Yeah, so 21 years ex-bourbon, and then the whole lot gets transferred and finished in the port pipes.
And you can feel the influence even of those 6 months. Lo que nos cuenta Gemma es que el Balvenie 21 años, que se llama Portwood, hecho en barricas de Oporto, ha estado los 21 años, por lo menos, en barricas de roble americano ex-bourbon. Y después lo pasan 6 meses más, solo 6 meses, pero los pasan a un tipo de... Los pasan a unas barricas de Oporto que ha estado en Tawny, pero que ha estado por cerca de 40 años. Para el momento en el que llega la barrica a Balvenie, o esas barricas, ya viene la madera muy, muy preparada, muy influenciada, con muy imbuido el Oporto en esa madera. Y esos solo 6 meses, como es una barrica tan antigua que tuvo tantos años el Oporto, hace la influencia. Andrés, ¿nos escuchas? Andrés.
Perfecto.
Ok. ¿Nos puedes contar lo que estás tomando?
Antes de Pablito y Gemma y todos que estoy tomando, me gustaría preguntarle algo a Gemma, que es, ya que estamos acá todos juntos, Gemma, me sorprende realmente y quisiera que nos contara realmente la magia que pasa en Balvenie, ¿no? Pues ya tenían un buen espíritu, un buen whisky logrado, y pues con estas referencias, pero cuando comienzan a hacer estos experimentos con pit, con turba, y vemos que es otro estilo totalmente diferente a Balvenie, ¿no? Pero pues con el sello de Balvenie, y pues ya que estamos acá, me gustaría que nos contaras como la magia, si son esos alambiques de cuello corto para su new make, su cantidad de ppm o su malteado o la selección de sus barricas, ¿no? Ya este new make se comporta de una manera mágica, ¿no? Siendo con pit, con turba o sin turba, ¿no? Y esto es un The Balvenie 16 years old triple cask, ¿no? También es mágico lo que pasa y cómo amalgaman muy bien las 3 barricas que se encuentran acá, ¿no? American Wild Cask, First Field, Oloroso, Chevrolet Cask, Bourbon Cask, ¿no? Es mágico lo que hace Balvenie para el mundo, ¿no?
Es el mismo que ese 16 Triple Cask es el mismo que tiene Vero. ¿El tuyo Vero es 16 Triple?
Sí.
Ok, Andrés está tomando el mismo que Vero. Andrés is asking about the magic of Balvenie. And why he calls it magic, he thinks it's incredible the way that this new make behaves and he doesn't know if it's the way that Balvenie chooses the wood how you age it, or if the magic is in the new making itself. But yeah, una cosa que yo quiero agregar es que también me parece que uno de los elementos más interesantes para mí de Balvenie es esta cosa de la paciencia y no apurarse, y se siente desde el diseño de sus botellas hasta el tipo de whisky que hacen, que es una incluso en el tour, Manu puede decir, pero hay tours donde te dicen sentate en el sofá a comer unas galletitas y después puedes entrar a disfrutar este momento antes de empezar a hablar de whisky. So esta cosa de la paciencia. Gemma, what I was saying is that Balvenie has this element that for me, beyond the people, is the second most important element, which is the patience and the no rush whiskey. And that you can even feel in the tour when they get you to sit in the leather sofa to get cookies before you get into whiskey. And what can you talk about what Andrés is asking in terms of the magic of Balvenie?
I think, Andres, that's such a beautiful way to put it, and such a lovely thing to say. I really do feel like there is such a magic, and it's why we all love Balvenie so much. And visiting the distillery, you've been there, Manu, going on site and being at Balvenie in Dufton, it feels like time stops. You know, things just slow down. You have to take a breath and take your time. And the distillery team, when they show you around, really make sure that you have a lot of time to absorb the process and the people, and meet the people there and see the way that we make our whiskey. And I think when you talk about the magic of Balvenie, for me, it comes down to the people, for sure, who make it, who represent it. I love the team that we work with across the range with Balvenie. And that's sort of set, I think, from David Stewart, kind of going right down. You know, we have an incredible mentor in David. He is so humble, he is so modest in what he does, but he is an incredible whiskey maker and has a wealth of experience and has done some amazing things for not just Balvenie, but for Scotch whiskey. But yet he's so humble and modest when it comes to the things that he's done. David will say, and this is a direct quote from David will say, if you take Balvenie and you make spirit and you put it into good wood, then you're going to have a great whiskey. And he's incredibly modest when he talks about his achievements, but he says, you know, he's got great materials to work with when it comes to...
So Gemma está diciendo que primero que agradece lo que Andrés dijo, muy lindas palabras sobre usar la palabra magia en esto, y la realidad que es un poco de todo, es un poco las buenas maderas, es un poco el buen new make, y ella está usando habla de esta cosa de tomarse su tiempo para tomar el whisky, que se perciben todas las etapas de Balvenie, y ella dice que usando una frase de David Stewart, si tenés un buen new make y buena madera, sale buen whisky. Muy humildemente, como diciendo, no hay secreto, no hay magia. There's no magic, no secret. You just need good new make, good woods, and good people. So it sounds like easy, and it's not easy.
It's not. And when you add to it, when you think about David's experience, to put it into perspective, David, we calculated, has nosed more than 400,000 casks of Balvenie. And yeah, in 400,000 casks he has nosed and looked at on average. That's just from kind of working out the number of days David has worked since he took over as master blender, and the number that he would typically nose on average in a day, which would be between sort of 30 and 50 casks a day that he'd be looking at. When David first joined back in 1962 and he took on his apprenticeship, he was 17 years old when he joined in 1962. He took on his apprenticeship when he was 19 years old. And he would be looking at casks of Balvenie going right back, so from the 1960s, the 50s, the 40s, the 30s. David remembers looking at casks from the 1920s from Balvenie, and then going right through to the present day. So essentially in David's brain is mapped the flavor profile of 100 years of distilling history at Balvenie.
Es increíble. Gemma está diciendo que David Stewart, que empezó cuando tenía 17 años, calcula que ha olfateado cerca de 400.000 barricas en su carrera, lo cual es fascinante porque tiene un mapa de prácticamente 100 años de historia, porque él recuerda cuando él empezó a trabajar en Balvenie que él ha probado y ha barricas desde que datan de 1920. Hoy en 2020 podemos decir que son 100 años de un mapa del estilo de Balvenie que está en su cabeza. Pregunta Nicolás Montoya, ¿qué Balvenie del Stories of Balvenie te identificas más? What drum from Balvenie stories you identify with, Gemma? There's a question from the audience.
That's a good question. I would say the 19 Edge of Burnhead Wood, this one, it's been such a labor of love, this whiskey.
Can you put it closer? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take the bottle out as well. So this is 19 years old. It's called the Edge of Burnhead Wood. Here's the bottle.
The Edge of Burnhead Woods. 19 años. El Balvenie 19 años, Nicolás, es el que ella más identifica. Why?
So this whiskey tells the story of basically the whiskey was distilled in 2000 from barley from a single field at Balvenie. It was the Berry Lees field, which is up the hill by Burnhead Wood, which you can see if you're at the distillery looking up to where the springs are. There's a tree line, that's Burnhead Wood. We have a field right in front of that called the Berry Lees. That's where we harvested the barley from in 1999 that we used to make this whiskey. Wow. And then when this whiskey it's 100% homegrown Balvenie, 100% home malted Balvenie. And then when we malted it, we used heather cropped from the same hillside above. The heather had grown right above the spring source that we use for Balvenie. And that heather was packed into the kiln while we were drying the malt. And then we only filled 50 casks in 2000 when we distilled it in August. So it's really a piece of Balvenie history. There was only 50 ex-American bourbon barrels filled with this. It's an experiment that we never recreated.
Este es un experimento que empezó en 1999 y lo destilaron en el año 2000, utilizando, no sé cuál sería la mejor traducción, depende del país, es heather, que es, en algunos países es brezo, ¿no?
Sí.
Y es todos elementos locales de cerca de la destilería. Este Burnhead Wood se ve ahí afuera de la destilería y es como un pedazo de historia, dice ella, por eso estas historias, y le parece como una obra de arte. También, you also mentioned about the art in the bottle.
Yeah, so it was a man called Andy Lovell who we worked with. He's an artist, a screen printer, and he went up and spent time at the distillery. He got to meet the people who were involved in the stories whiskies, and he's created each of these. These are works of art that he's separately created that we've adapted to the bottle.
También hay arte original.
And then at the back you have the full story. So there's a lot of words on this packaging. You have the full story. If anyone is interested, unfortunately they are only in English language, but if anyone wants to listen to any of the podcast that we created, so each of the bottles, we made some podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
I spent some time interviewing the craftsmen at the distillery, and went out, for example, for one of the stories, Kelsey and I went out to Kentucky and went to go to the Kelvin Cooperage to meet with the family there who make barrels for the Sweet Toast of American Oak. Then Week of Peat, you'll hear Ian Miller talking all about the peat trials for the Edge of Burnhead Wood. We speak to Dave Stewart and Robbie Gormley, who went and they were responsible for the heather and malting the barley. So each one is around 30 minutes long. You can see them on the Balvenie website or Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud.
Gemma nos cuenta que hay unos podcasts en inglés sobre estas estas historias de estas botellas especiales de Balvenie, que incluso ella estuvo en Kentucky con Kelsey entrevistando a gente relacionada con esas barricas de roble americano que llegaron luego a Escocia. También hay otras entrevistas con estos hombres que han estado tantos años en Balvenie para entender más las historias. We're gonna go one more question, and quiero agradecer a todos los que se prendieron en vivo. Después, este episodio de Whisky en tu casa va a quedar tanto en YouTube como creo tal vez en Facebook. Le mando también un saludo especial a Jojo, que se prendió al final, del grupo Edrington, con el cual tuve un muy lindo podcast ayer a la noche en Nocturno en Whisky. I'm just saying thank you to the people that was listening and watching, and I'm saying hello to Jojo, the Edrington ambassador in Colombia, that yesterday was in my podcast. So one more question. Who wants to go for the last question? Manu. Manu, la última.
Yeah,
Vamos, Manu.
Yeah. Bueno, tengo una pequeña reflexión a lo que decíamos sobre David, que yo siempre digo que puedes hacer un buen whisky con una buena política de maderas, pero si no tienes un gran New Make Spirit, por muy buena política de maderas que tengas, jamás tendrás un gran whisky, y eso es muy importante, que a veces nos fijamos mucho en todo lo demás, en la parte de madera, pero si el New Make Spirit no es grande, por mucho juego que le des, nunca vas a conseguir esa magia que hablaba Andrés, ¿no? Eso por un lado, y yo creo que es muy importante que la audiencia se quede con ese concepto, que es el todo, desde que empiezas a maltear o compras tu malta hasta que llega a la botella, todos los procesos tienen muchísima importancia, aunque quizá organolépticamente el peso de la madera en el whisky es con lo que nos quedemos, ¿no? Sí, pregúntale. Y luego le hago la pregunta. Sí, traduce si quieres.
So, before the last question, he's just reflecting on what David said about the importance of a good new make and a good wood, that a lot of times we focus too much in the wood and we minimize the importance of the new make. So you can put a lot of effort in using great woods and going through the maturation, but the reality is that if you don't have a great new make, it's not going to work as good, talking about the magic. Now the question.
¿Qué podemos esperar de ese release tan número 6 que yo tengo pero aún no abierto, que me esperaré cuando abra la botella? Y volverá el 15 Single Barrel, que es una de mis expresiones favoritas, que se discontinuó hace tiempo. En el mercado español lo teníamos mucho, era un Single Barrel de American Oak y llevamos tiempo sin probar. Tengo alguna botellita guardada también por si acaso.
Que en Estados Unidos está todavía.
Está todavía, pues a nuestro mercado no llega. El Single Barrel, el American Oak, aquí no llega. Antes era un 15 Single Barrel.
El American Oak.
Eso es.
No, en Estados Unidos creo que está el Jerez. So he's asking about if you can talk about the release 6.
The
no, right?
6. Yeah, the TAN 6.
Which one? Manu?
The release number 6 of the TAN series that just arrived to
release number 6 of the TAN series. And also if there's any chance to see the 15-year-old single barrel American again.
Oh, these are great questions. The ton batch 6, we've maybe there's kind of staggered launches, I guess, for them. We've just launched batch 7, so we're actually on to number 7 of the ton. Batch 6 was the 2019 release, and we've had batch 7 that was just released last October. So that's something that's really been, quite a legacy with Balvenie, is that ton series, going right back to ton 1401 that we launched in 2010, which was very small batch. The ton was 2,000 litres, and the very first batch of ton 1401 was a distillery exclusive, so you had to come to Balvenie to be able to buy a bottle of that ton. Then in 2014, we built a larger ton, which is the ton 1509 that we have today, so it holds 8,000 litres. And ever since, we've had those batches, and each one is individual and unique. So we've had the recent release of batch 7 will use a combination of different casks. So we'll have a combination of American oak ex-bourbon barrels that has also got some refill Spanish oak barrels in there. We've actually used a batch of doublewood barrels, doublewood butts. So these are sherry butts that we've sourced from Jerez. They've been delivered to Balvenie. We've used them as a finish for doublewood, and then we've then filled them with new make spirit, put them out into the warehouse, and now those butts have now gone into the makeup of batch 7 and batch 6 of ton 1509. So it really is a combination of casks, different cask types and different ages. So the whiskey is from around 20 to 40 years old that David selects for each batch of the ton as well. And now this is, a lot of the time I get quite a few questions. People say you don't have any non-age statement Balvenies. Well, actually we do have a non-age statement Balvenie, which is the ton, but I think it's similar. It's a great example of a non-age statement whiskey. It's one that David really puts his kind of heart and soul into, and a lot of creativity into, in selecting a varied variety of flavor profiles and ages in the cask and bringing that together to create a whiskey that's necessarily, if you took those individual casks, we wouldn't bottle them as a single barrel bottling, but he's taking them together to create something great and delicately and layering the flavor to create a kind of complex whiskey.
So, voy a tratar de hacer un resumen. Estos ediciones TUN, T-U-N, son ediciones limitadas de Balvenie, que es el whisky que tienen sin identificar la edad, de lo que se le dice non-age statement, pero son whiskies donde Gemma cuenta que David Stewart pone su corazón y su alma porque son uno de sus favoritos y más difíciles de crear, y son whiskies que rondan entre 20 y 40 años de edad y que usan diferentes tipos de barricas en las diferentes expresiones que salen. Are they usually once a year or no?
Once a year.
The batches. Ahora están en el batch número 6 y 7. Manu preguntaba por el 6, pero aparentemente las 7 ya está saliendo. Y cada batch es diferente. Respondió.
And the 15 years?
The 15, is it? So, yeah, I would love it if we brought the 15 single barrel bourbon back as well. We have changed that range a little bit this year. So we've now got a 21 refill bourbon matured Balvenie that's within the single barrel range. So you have the 12, which is first fill bourbon. You've got the 15, which is sherry. And then you have the 21, which is refill bourbon.
So Balvenie es una de las pocas, one of the few distilleries with single barrels in some type of core range. Es una de las pocas destilerías que tiene single barrels en su gama principal, que siempre las vas a ver en las tiendas que tienen, por supuesto, un montón de Balvenie. Y si no, en muchos países solo llega el 12, tal vez el 14. Pero estos single barrels son el 12 años es ex-bourbon, el 15 ex-Jerez, y acaban de sacar un 21 ex-bourbon. Manu preguntaba por el 15 ex-bourbon que antes existía y ahora ya no. So we're going to have to close. And it has been a pleasure. It has been
It's felt so quick.
Fue rápido. It was quick, yes. Gracias de nuevo a Vero, a Andrés y Manu. Es un placer siempre contar con ustedes y unir estos países. Always a pleasure to get Argentina, Colombia, Spain, the US, and now Scotland together. So where is the next one? Once the pandemic finishes, where do we meet?
I would love to meet. I would love for us all to go to Manu's bar and meet at the bar.
We can open that TUN 6. Yeah, I'll open that TUN 6 if you come. No problem. I invite. It's on my own.
You're gonna open the bar even if the government tells you no. If we do it now.
The bar is closed now.
The bar is closed. Gemma dice que le encantaría que nos encontremos en Bilbao. Estoy de acuerdo. Yo me encantaría ir a Bilbao a ver a Manu. también siempre vamos a estar todos tirando para que sea en Escocia, ¿no?
Puesto.
we wouldn't mind going to Balvenie either.
Sí, de hecho,
You're
a mí
welcome.
me gustaría que si visita la Argentina, poder presentarle a nuestros amigos Lila y Néstor Serenelli de La Lazana y que conozca a ella también una destilería de acá, del fin del mundo, porque somos el último país, así que me encantaría invitarlos a todos en realidad, Manu.
Vero is offering us to also go to the Patagonia in Argentina to visit La Lazana, the single malt distillery in Argentina, and to meet Lila and Nestor. They're a married couple. They are both the master distillers. They share the roles, and it's a very interesting whiskey. If you ever go to Argentina, you had to stop in that distillery.
I would love to.
Gracias a todos. Andrés, estuvo un poco cortada tu comunicación, pero te agradezco de nuevo y si quieres saludar también.
No,
Quiere beber.
no nada, Gemma. Por su tiempo. Sí, tuve una mala señal. Discúlpeme.
No hay problema. No hay problema. Andrés say thank you, Gemma. The internet was a little spotty, but it happens. Oh, ahí está Lila en los comentarios. Saludos desde Patagonia. Lila, we were just talking about Lila. She just showed up in the comments saying, hello, everybody from Patagonia. Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have them. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Gemma, again. And until the next one. Gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Amazing. Thank you all. Cheers.
Slancha.
Salud.
Slancha.